Okay, so here's what actually happened today that nobody in Washington predicted, nobody in the financial press predicted, and nobody in the international trade community believed was coming this fast. Trump caved. The President of the United States, the man who built his entire political brand on never backing down, never admitting defeat, never letting an opponent walk away from a confrontation with their head held high. That man just blinked in front of the cameras, in front of the world, in front of every country that has been watching this trade war and drawing conclusions about American resolve and American credibility. And Mark Carney, the former central banker, the technocrat, the man that every Trump advisor dismissed as someone who would prioritize stability over confrontation and come to the table on American terms. That man is now dictating the terms, Canada's terms. Let me tell you exactly what happened, why it happened, what triggered it specifically, and what it means for everything that comes next. For USMCA, for the North American economy, for every other country watching America's allies push back against coercion and succeed. Because this is not just a trade story. This is not just a story about lumber prices and tariff schedules and WTO dispute mechanisms. This is a story about power, about leverage, about what happens when a government that mistakes noise for strength runs out of road and discovers that the country it was trying to bully had the patience, the strategy, and the will to outlast it. Here is what actually triggered the cave. The Trump administration's trade war against Canada was always built on a single foundational bet. The bet was that Canada's economic dependence on American market access was so deep, so structural, so woven into the fabric of the Canadian economy that Canada would absorb a certain amount of pain and then fold that the tariffs would hurt enough, the uncertainty would be damaging enough, and the threat of further escalation would be credible enough that Carney would eventually calculate that accepting American terms was better than continuing to write. That bet was wrong from the beginning. It failed for reasons that were entirely predictable to anyone who actually understood the economics, understood Canadian political culture, and understood what kind of leader Mark Carney actually is. It failed because Canada had more leverage than Washington assumed. It failed because Carney built alternatives faster and more effectively than anyone in the Trump administration anticipated. It failed because the economic pain of the trade war turned out to be more symmetrical than the administration's model suggested, hurting American manufacturers, American consumers, and American businesses in ways that were visible, measurable, and politically costly in exactly the states and districts that matter most to Republican electoral survival. And it failed because Republican governors, Republican senators, and Republican-aligned business leaders started making phone calls to the White House, not about backing Trump's hardline position, about stopping the bleeding before the economic damage became irreversible, and the midterm political cost became unsurvivable. Not diplomacy, not international pressure, the Republican Party's own economic self-interest expressed through the phone calls of governors and senators who realized that the trade war was costing their constituents real money every single week. Not Carney's rhetoric, though that was effective. Not Canada's WTO complaints, though those were legally devastating. Not the diplomatic pressure from European allies, though that added to the isolation Washington was feeling. Not even the market movements that were daily reminders of the real economic cost of the trade war. The phone calls from Republicans in Michigan and Wisconsin and Minnesota and Montana who told the White House that the trade war was costing their constituents real money and that they needed it to stop. Now let me tell you what Carney's terms actually look like. Because this is the part of the story that matters most for understanding what Canada has actually achieved here and what the future of the North American trade relationship actually holds. Carney is not asking. He is not proposing a framework for negotiation. He is not suggesting areas where further discussion might produce mutually acceptable outcomes. He is dictating because when you have built the leverage, when you have demonstrated the will to use it, and when the other side has run out of options, dictating is exactly what you do. And the terms he is dictating reflect the full strength of the leverage position that Canada built over the months of this trade war, while Washington was busy congratulating itself on its toughness. First, the immediate and unconditional removal of all tariffs imposed in violation of USMCA. Not a phased removal, not a negotiated drawdown over months or years, immediate removal. Because Canada has been clear from the beginning that the tariffs violate the agreement that both countries signed, and there is no legitimate legal basis for keeping them in place for a single additional day. Second, the withdrawal of all Section 301 investigations and Section 232 national security designations targeting Canadian goods. These investigations were legally indefensible from the moment they were launched against an ally with a clean trade record. Their withdrawal is a non-negotiable precondition for any restoration of normal trade relations. Third, and this is the one that the Trump team is finding hardest to swallow, a formal acknowledgement that Canada's retaliatory measures were justified responses to American violations of USMCA, not the unfair trade practices that the Trump administration tried to characterize them as. That acknowledgement matters because it establishes the legal and diplomatic record of what actually happened in this trade war. And it prevents the administration from rewriting history to claim that Canada was the aggressor. Let me talk about what the market reaction tells you about who actually had leverage in this fight, because the numbers are illuminating in ways that the political commentary often misses. When the initial reports of Trump's capitulation broke, American markets moved in ways that confirmed exactly what serious economists have been saying for months, that the trade war was costing the American economy far more than the Trump administration's public messaging acknowledged. Lumber prices began normalizing as markets priced in the return of Canadian supply to American construction channels. Energy futures adjusted as traders reassessed the supply security of American energy markets that had been operating under uncertainty about Canadian export availability. Automotive sector stocks in the United States moved positively as investors calculated the restoration of the integrated supply chain that American car manufacturers depend on for parts and components that cross the border multiple times during production. And the broader manufacturing indices moved as American companies that had been quietly but urgently making contingency plans for a world without stable Canadian supply began standing down those contingency plans and returning to normal procurement models. These market movements are not just financial data points to be noted and filed away. They are a real-time verdict rendered by the most efficient, most brutally honest information aggregation system on Earth on who was actually winning this trade war and who was absorbing more damage than they could sustain. The markets had known for months that Canada had more leverage than Washington was admitting publicly. Traders and analysts and institutional investors had been pricing in the supply disruption risk, the input cost increases, and the supply chain restructuring costs that the trade war was imposing on American industry. What happened when Trump caved is that the markets rapidly priced out those risks. The adjustment was swift and significant because the underlying reality that this trade war was far more costly to the American economy than the administration was willing to acknowledge had been visible to anyone looking at the actual numbers. I want to talk about what this moment means for Mark Carney personally and for Canada strategically, because I think it is important to name what has actually been accomplished here and not allow it to be minimized or reframed by the spin that the Trump administration is already preparing. What Carney has done over the course of this trade war is genuinely historic. He inherited a situation in which Canada was structurally dependent on American market access to a degree that gave Washington enormous leverage over Ottawa. He could have managed that situation the way previous Canadian governments managed it, with careful diplomacy, strategic concessions, and a general posture of accommodation designed to avoid direct confrontation with a more powerful neighbor. He chose to stand firm when every piece of conventional political wisdom said to find a face-saving compromise. He chose to build real alternatives when previous Canadian governments had treated the American relationship as so essential that alternatives were barely worth exploring. He chose to absorb the short-term economic pain of refusing to capitulate. The investment uncertainty, the trade disruption, the pressure from Canadian businesses that depend on American market access in exchange for the long-term strategic benefit of demonstrating that Canadian sovereignty was not for sale at any price, and that Canadian resolve was not something that could be worn down by tariff escalation. And he chose to do all of this while running a country, managing a domestic political environment, and maintaining the support of a Canadian public that was watching every move. The fact that he is now dictating terms to the President of the United States is not luck. It is not circumstance. It is the result of months of disciplined, intelligent, strategically coherent decision-making by a leader who understood from the beginning that the outcome of this conflict would be determined not by who could apply the most pressure, but by who could hold out the longest. Canada held out the longest. Carney won. Now, let me be honest about something, because this story deserves honesty more than it deserves triumphalism. A capitulation is not the same as a resolution. Trump caving to the immediate pressure of economic pain and Republican political anxiety is not the same as the Trump administration genuinely changing its approach to trade, to alliances, or to the use of economic coercion as a foreign policy tool. The July 2026 USMCA review deadline still exists. The underlying tensions in the relationship still exist. The fundamental instability of an administration whose trade policy is driven by political performance rather than economic analysis still exists. What Canada has won is not a permanent peace, and it would be a mistake to treat it as one. What Canada has won is something more durable and more strategically significant than a temporary truce. Canada has won a demonstrated track record of successful resistance against the most powerful economy in the world. Canada has won a better negotiating position for every future interaction with this administration and with any future American administration that might consider using economic coercion as a tool against its northern neighbor. And Canada has won a set of terms that, if honored, will restore the trade relationship to something approaching normal function, while establishing a legal and diplomatic record that protects Canada's interests in any future dispute. Whether those terms are honored is a different question. Trump's history of making commitments and then abandoning them when they become politically inconvenient is well documented. Carney knows this better than anyone, which is why he has spent months watching every Trump commitment carefully. Which is why the terms he is now dictating are not based on trust, not based on goodwill, and not based on any assumption that the Trump administration will honor its commitments out of principle. They are based on verification mechanisms built into the USMCA framework. They are based on WTO dispute procedures that can be activated automatically if compliance lapses. They are based on the kind of institutional, legally enforceable guarantees that make compliance a structural reality rather than a discretionary choice that can be reversed when it becomes politically convenient. If you are Canadian watching this, take this moment for what it is. Your Prime Minister stood up to the most powerful country in the world, held his ground under enormous pressure, built the leverage that made resistance sustainable, and extracted terms that reflect the strength of Canada's actual position. That is a genuine historic achievement, one that should be understood as exactly that, not minimized, not hedged, not qualified into irrelevance. If you are American watching this, what you are watching is the direct and entirely avoidable result of a trade war that never needed to happen. A trade war that was built on false premises that were debunked from the first day they were stated. A trade war that caused real, measurable, lasting economic damage on both sides of the border. A trade war that American workers and American businesses and American consumers paid for every single week while it was running. And a trade war that ended with the United States accepting terms rather than dictating them. A result that the Trump administration's own advisors told their principals would never happen, and that the administration's public communications promised repeatedly would never happen. July 2026 is still coming. The USMCA review is still coming. The underlying questions about the future of North American trade and the reliability of American commitments are still unresolved, and they will not be resolved by a single capitulation, however significant. The next chapter of this story has not been written yet, and it would be premature to assume it will be easy. But today specifically, today on camera, today in front of the entire watching world, Canada dictated the terms. The most powerful country in the world blinked. And a Canadian Prime Minister who was told he would fold, who was dismissed as a technocrat who would prioritize stability over principle, who was underestimated at every single turn by an administration that confused aggression with strength, stood his ground and won. July 2026 is coming. Canada is ready. The world watched.